So I think we'll go ahead and start. Hopefully others will be able to join us soon. Thank you very much and welcome to this session on agri-food labor. My name is Felix Kwame Yeboah. I'm an assistant professor and the director for Partnership for Sustainable Community Development at Michigan State University. And I'm really pleased to be here to moderate this session with you today. And as we are all aware, the issues of employment, both in terms of quantity and quality, is a present challenge around the world, and more so when you start thinking about it from the developing economies. So if you think about places in the continent of Africa, you have the gap between the number of young people that are entering the labor force each year and available employment in the formal wage sector, widening by about 8 million people a year. And the agriculture and food systems, which comprise the farm as well as the off-farm segment of the agri-food system, is generally considered to be an important sector of opportunity. But there are a lot of challenges that comes with this particular area. We're talking about issues of the quality of jobs that is you would produce. There are also measurement issues and also questions about do we even have young people that are interested in this particular sector as we are looking at the youth bulge? And these are all issues that we need to deal with. And then when you add on top of it the measurement issues, because if we are going to make a strong case for investment in the agriculture and food sector, we need to know what we are measuring, what are the current levels, and what are some of prospects for advancing economic opportunities through this agri-food system. And these are questions that are on our minds and questions that I'm hoping that our panel today will help us to address today as we move into this. So to do that, we have three very interesting presentations and three panelists who will share their perspective on that. So I'll go ahead and introduce our panelists, and then the session is going to be structured in a way that we will first of all take the three presentations, and then we'll move into a panel discussion where we engage them a little bit more about their work, and then afterwards I'm going to open it up for the audience to also ask questions. So that's how we are going to structure our presentations, the session for today. So I do have just quickly introduce my panelists. The first one is Dr. Kate Schneider, who is a researcher at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, where she's also part of the Global Food Ethics and Policy Program. So her work focuses on the access to healthy foods, food system transformation, and welfare outcome for farmers and workers in food systems. And prior to joining Johns Hopkins, she completed her PhD at the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy at Tufts University, and spent about 5 years at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation on the agricultural development team. So that's Kate right there. Our next speaker is Alexandra Hill, who is also an assistant professor in the College of Agricultural Science at Colorado State University. And her research interest involves around issues on agricultural labor, economic productivity, agricultural business management, and applied industrial organization. And much of her current work has focused on US agricultural workers. And then joining us virtually is our third panelist in the person of Dr. James Thoreau, who is a development economist whose research focuses on the interactions between policies, economic growth, and poverty, primarily using computable general equilibrium and micro-simulation modeling. And he has worked with various governments and researchers throughout sub-Saharan Africa, and in Bangladesh, in Peru, Tunisia, and Vietnam. Please, let's welcome our panelists. And on that note, I will yield the podium and ask Kate to begin our presentation. Kate, thank you very much. Each panelist will have 10 minutes to present.
Thank you so much, Kwame. I'm going to time myself because 10 minutes is hard for me. Try and keep myself honest here. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Oh, I don't think I shared my screen to the Zoom either. Apologies. Okay. All right, there we go. Thank you for your patience. I'm Dr. Kate Schneider, and I'll be sharing some work that is joint with a long list of people whose names are here that I've had the privilege of working with. I'm not going to read them all out, but a lot of them are at FAO, and a few of us interlopers they've allowed in to work with them on this project. And we've been looking at the question of how many people rely on agri-food systems for their livelihoods. Please note this work is under peer review, and the content and findings can't be distributed or shared. So I just ask you to please don't take any pictures of my slides, otherwise I'll get in trouble with FAO. Appreciate it. All right, just a bit of motivation. Global and national policy agendas have been shifting away from the traditional silos of agriculture, nutrition, health, and environment, and thinking about challenges that are facing the whole of agri-food systems from a systems perspective. Food systems go beyond agriculture. They include all of the other processes, infrastructure, and actors that do everything: the production, the processing, the transport, the trade, and the service of food. And then when you think about agri-food systems, this also includes the non-food agricultural products, fibers, forestry, tobacco, et cetera. And you can see a schematic of a food system for diets and nutrition from the seminal high-level panel of experts report on food systems and nutrition from 2017. And so many of us, as we headed into COVID with this context of policy agendas, starting to think from a food systems perspective, we're concerned about the impacts of COVID on food systems. The UN put out this report in 2020 that estimated the number of jobs and livelihoods that were at risk due to COVID-19. And some of us looked at this table and we saw that unpublished estimates, and we wondered where these numbers came from, and we said, are these the right numbers? And we wanted to take a systematic approach to understand how do we count people in food systems, because food systems are not an economic activity, and so it's not easy to observe the whole of employment in food systems directly from the existing statistics. However, the existing statistics is the place to start. The ILO has a mandate to produce global employment statistics. So this is where we started in our effort to count how many people are employed or rely on food systems. They have these data at the 2-digit ISIC coding level, which is a coding of economic activities. And I'll show you what that looks like for classifying agri-food systems in a moment. And it gives us data for 120 countries with at least one data point in the last 20 years. So with the ISIC codes, this is how we can classify food systems. These are the codes that go into people we are counting as employed in food systems. However, as you probably noticed, I didn't give you tons of time to absorb that table, but there's a few things missing. Notably, it can't identify jobs in trade and transport, because these are not easy to distinguish between agri-food and non-agri-food. And then there's also gaps in the country year data. And so in order to fill in those gaps, ILO provides modeled estimates. Those modeled estimates aren't sufficiently disaggregated for our purposes. Unfortunately, they're only at the broad sectors of agriculture, manufacturing, and services. And so we take an approach ourselves. I'm going to call this the FAO modeled estimates, just to distinguish from the official ILO modeled estimates, where we try and estimate the rest of jobs in agri-food systems for those years where the country year data are missing. So we start by grouping the data into jobs in agriculture and jobs in everything else in food systems. And the first approach we take is to look just within countries, can we just interpolate those missing data with a linear trend? And in some of the countries we can, given where the gaps are, and in some of them we still have missing data. And so then in those cases, we predict the share of employment, the ratio of non-agricultural jobs in food systems to agricultural jobs. As a first way to get at this, we predict that on the basis of the share of agricultural employment, urban population, GDP per capita, and share of ag in GDP. And then once we estimate that, we have the ILO modeled estimates for jobs in agriculture, which we multiply by the predicted ratio so that we can then estimate the number of people who are working in just the non-agricultural part of AFS, which is what was missing or unobservable in the construction of the ILO modeled estimates. So here are the numbers that we get. When we're looking at jobs, official classification of employment, which means a primary job in the last 7 days, we are able to identify just over a billion people in the world whose livelihoods, who are employed in food systems. And you can see that these are total numbers by region. They play out just as you might expect. And in green, we see the jobs in agriculture, and blue, the jobs in the rest of food systems. Thinking about this as a share of total employment, I apologize, this is quite blurry, but the y-axis here is share of total employment. And the teal is the share of total employment that's in the non-agricultural part of food systems. And that's what I want you to see on this graph here, is that that section of employment is really pretty similar across regions. It's consistently between 5 and 10% of all employment. We can look at the relationship between employment and agri-food systems and GDP. If we look at all of employment in agri-food systems, in the top panel there, you see that it declines with GDP, but if we divide out agriculture from the rest of the food system, we can see that that trend is really driven by a decline in jobs in agriculture, which go down as expected with GDP, but the jobs in the rest of food systems actually go up as GDP increases. And lastly, we can see these trends over time. Again, on the top, you see all of the jobs combined, slight decline over time, especially in Africa and Asia. But when we break it out in the bottom, you can see that decline is driven entirely by jobs in agriculture decreasing, and jobs in all of the rest of food systems have been pretty consistently constant over time across all regions. So next, we wanted to look at some of the limitations of the ILO stat data, and we have a rich harmonized household survey database called RULIS that the FAO has been building for the last several years. And we can use further detailed information about the coding of people's work and jobs. There's more detailed levels of coding, of the ISIC coding in some of these surveys. And there's information about multiple jobs, so secondary, tertiary, some surveys even report up to a 4th job. And then we can also measure engagement in household farming. And so then once we count all of these other things that aren't primary jobs in the ILO standard labor classification, we call that engagement in agri-food systems, just to be really clear that it is a separate, we're counting something different. So these are the number of people who are involved in different activities, jobs, or household farming related to agri-food systems. And then we can also look at who's in their households. And when we do that, and we consider everyone in a household where at least one person has engagement in agri-food systems as relying at least in part on food systems, thank you, then we get these people reliant. So just a quick set of results, just to give some intuition, well, how much does that difference in definition matter if you just count employment versus engagement? We're only able to do this for a handful of surveys at the moment, since processing these data take quite a bit of time, but we have 65 countries in the RULIS database. So theoretically, we could keep going. And you can see that for some countries, it's a small percentage point difference. For others, it's larger. But in general, these are meaningful magnitudes of the percentage difference when we count people who are doing secondary jobs, working in household farming, et cetera. So considering these other ways of being engaged in agri-food systems seems to be a meaningful number of people that would be missed if we're only counting total employment. We then want to extrapolate this out to a global model to understand how many people are relying on food systems. We don't have household data for all of these countries in the world. We only had them for the household surveys in a handful of countries. And so we have modeled this out. As you can see here, I'll just quickly, I'm not going to read through the model, but what we get to is the interesting part is we estimate about 3.66 billion people live in a household where at least one person is engaged in the agri-food system, at least in part for their livelihoods, and that 1.1 billion people are employed directly. So just a couple of conclusions. This current work, we're proud that it advances what with a systematic methodology, the quantification of work and labor in agri-food systems. What we can do with ILO data is great, but it's imperfect. Household survey data helps us fill in what we might be missing. And that we estimate is a real meaningful additional set of people whose livelihoods really do rely on agri-food systems that we wouldn't see in labor statistics. And our best available estimate that we get to at the moment is 3.66 billion people who are living in households reliant, at least in part, on agri-food systems. And then I'll just leave with a couple of challenges that I hope we'll be discussing in our panel discussion today. We take advantage of survey data to go beyond what the statistics can do. The problem is those surveys are not comparable across countries. And so that's a real limitation when we really want to think about, have we really captured everybody consistently, systematically in these countries who are engaged as opposed to just employed. And again, the ELO estimates are missing trade and transport, which I hope you'll hear more from James about how we might be able to address that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate. I think we'll go ahead and take Ali's presentation, and then we'll take James so that we can move into our discussion.
I too will set a timer because I'm bad at managing my time. But cool. All right. So hi everyone, I'm Ali Hill. I'm an assistant professor at Colorado State University. I kind of got brought into this panel as they had some people swapping. And so in planning this, we were kind of just talking about what everyone's working on. And one emerging theme was just kind of about data quality and measurement in the broad field of labor and agricultural food systems. And as Kwame introduced me, I mostly work in US agricultural labor. So today I'm going to be talking about some trying to use data to inform our understanding of US agricultural labor markets and kind of broadly related to this. So what I'm talking about today are migratory patterns of US crop workers. And specifically, I want to show you some work I'm doing to geographically define agricultural labor markets within the US. And I didn't put the list of names here, but this is a piece of a larger project that I'm going to use to motivate the importance of this. That's with Tom Hurdle at Purdue, two of his postdocs who are Surashi Ray, Iman Hakiki, and then Ed Taylor at UC Davis. So why is it important? Like, why are agricultural labor markets important? So the first thing to understand is that within the US and probably everywhere, but agricultural labor markets are changing. So this picture on the left, I'm like a pacer, but is from an article from the late 30s that had interviewed a lot of different families of migrant workers across the US. And this particular one is just for California, and it's tracing the historic route of US crop workers for these like 50 Mexican families that they interviewed. So this dark line kind of traces the path most followed by people. And so you start in the winter in Southern California, you kind of work your way up. These lighter lines are perhaps less followed, but you see among some families. And then down here, you can see workers going back to Mexico and other states as well. So the historical route of US crop workers was usually north-south. Some of them were going in circular motions, and then some would go back down to Mexico and back up. So today, what we're seeing is US crop workers are migrating less, and most evidence points to this being due to either demographic changes in the population. So the workforce is aging, workers are more likely to be living with family members, so they're more hesitant to be moving all the time. And then about the other piece of that are more structural changes. So we have immigration policy, we have relative wages or other employment conditions in the US versus Mexico that are going to influence the extent to which people want to move. So because workers are migrating less, we're also seeing farm labor markets becoming more localized. And some people have pointed to this as a potential reason for the plethora of news articles you hear about shortages of agricultural workers. So why is this important? So the larger project that this piece that I'm going to show you today is a part of is to do with the role of agricultural labor markets in agricultural production. So we can all understand that labor market shocks can have widespread impacts on the farm and broadly food sector. And we saw this pretty saliently during COVID. We also saw it beforehand with many reports of worker shortages and farmers plowing fields and not being able to complete harvest. And there's also a small but growing body of work that's looking at the interplay between labor markets and how agricultural producers respond to environmental shocks. So this is to date been mostly to do with temperature and precipitation and how that influences outflows of workers from rural to more urban areas as it affects yields and other things that we care about in agriculture. But just more like kind of conceptually, we can understand that if you don't have workers, you won't be able to produce in a given area. And so the big motivation behind this project is that in most models, like, so here, these graphs were made using simple G, so it's a partial equilibrium modeling framework. They assume an elasticity of labor supply for agricultural workers within a region, which will be the entire US, but it doesn't restrict worker mobility within the US. And so we're challenging that that's an appropriate assumption. And so to kind of give an example of the implications of making that assumption, here we're showing, we're modeling the effects of a conservation policy that is, so it's restricting groundwater use in excess of replenishment rates. This part's a little bit outside my field, but anyways. So basically, these are the areas that would be affected by that policy. What we'd expect to see is that producers would have to decrease the amount of irrigated crop production in areas that are affected. So these are the areas that are affected. The general simple G framework doesn't include any restrictions on labor mobility. So if we see a reduction in irrigated crop production, which is going to be blue down here, we'll look at perfect labor mobility for now. Then the reduction can be replaced by increases in production elsewhere, which is going to be the red. So if we don't make any restrictions on labor mobility, we'll just assume workers will magically appear in these new areas and start harvesting and helping do all the activities for crop production. But if we restrict labor mobility to each of these dots are at a grid cell level, so it's about, depending on where you are in the US, about 40 kilometers. If we restrict labor mobility to 40-kilometer areas, which is a pretty unrealistic assumption, then what we see is decreases in the amount of irrigated agriculture, and within this snapshot, it actually goes, it has some changes there, but we don't actually see any increases in other places because the production isn't able to move to other grids where there aren't workers. So that's these are kind of like two extremes that you can think about in considering the importance of agricultural labor markets in modeling environmental outcomes and other sorts of outcomes. But our main goal for the project is to understand the linkage between the functioning of these local agricultural labor markets and the responses of agriculture to environmental stressors, conservation policies, and other shocks. So we'll also look at immigration reform. But for this presentation, and my role in this as the labor economist, is just to geographically define these labor market areas or labor sheds for US agricultural workers. So really quickly to do that, I'm just going to give you two available labor market delineations to explain why these aren't really appropriate for crop workers. And then I'll show you how we're going to adapt one of those methodologies to try to construct labor areas for US agricultural workers. So potentially the only one that I would expect people to have heard of are called commuting zones. These were originally created by the ERS. The most recent ones were replicated by some demographers who are called to help me figure out how to replicate this for ag workers. And they're constructed using the American Community Survey. Basically, they construct groups of areas based on where someone lives and where someone works. So you want to group together counties in which a high proportion of people live and work within some region, and those are called commuting zones. Then there's the Bureau of Economic Analysis puts out economic areas, which have a really similar methodology behind it, but they are constructed using data from the decennial census. They're much larger than commuting zones. So there's 179 of these. The most recent commuting zones were 600, and great, we're going to go through the rest of these. So for reasons just in terms of how that's constructed, neither of those methodologies are perfect for US agricultural workers, because we don't exactly care about someone living and working within a particular area. I care about having labor available across the year at the time when the crop needs to be harvested. So for that reason alone, these aren't great definitions for us. But we can also see that if we look, so this graph is showing the percentage of workers who are living and working across the blue line is counties, the red line are economic areas, and then this line is commuting zones. So we see that there's still a fairly high proportion of workers who are commuting across those delineations. And then more importantly, we see that those the economic areas are maybe too large to be meaningful for agricultural workers. So it's grouping together a lot of counties that don't even show up in our data because the workers aren't working in urban areas. So anyways, I will cut to the chase. I'm going to use data from this survey called the National Agricultural Workers Survey, which is a nationally representative survey of US crop workers. And I'll skip that next slide because it didn't work out very well, but it includes information on each worker's work history for the previous 2 years. So I can track each county that an individual has lived or worked in the last 2 years. And I can use that with a similar methodology to what they use to construct commuting zones to create a measure of relatedness between two counties based on the proportion of workers who have worked in those within the last 2 years. So basically, it's just this fairly simple ratio that in the literature is called proportional flow. And here we're just going to do the count of workers who've worked in both county I and J divided by the number of the minimum of the number of distinct workers who worked in either of those counties. And we'll go very quickly. So these are examples of a measure of proportional flow for Monterey County, which is the county where most agricultural workers come from. So what you'll see is that we actually get the darker numbers indicate higher degrees of relatedness. But what happens is we have few workers on the denominator. And so we end up with a high measure of proportional flow. So this is all the way from here, saying that I see people who have ever worked in Monterey County have worked in all these other areas across the US, which is not something you would capture in commuting zones. So basically, I've run this for every county in the United States, created a matrix of how related these things are, and then used a clustering technique to combine the counties into groups that seem like viable agricultural labor sheds. And I'll show you just the preferred one, which we're still working on. So what's interesting is this is just so much different from what it'll look like with commuting zones, where kind of by default, you're going to get really close together clusters. Whereas here, what we see for California, for example, is that we see this kind of circulatory flow that workers follow. And that actually is kind of consistent with historical flow. Sorry, that was really fast. So for next steps, we're working on kind of tracking this throughout time. So in the NAS, we can do basically every 10 years and kind of see how those labor shed delineations have changed. I'm also currently playing with different measures of proportional flow, because as we see, there's also just like a lot of messiness over here that we don't really want a couple of random counties in Washington to be grouped with everything on the East Coast. And I won't talk about my related work, so we'll stop there, but I'm happy to talk more so I can do that.
Well, thank you very much, Andy. At this point, we'll turn over to James. James, can you hear me?
I can, and hopefully you can hear me and see the screen. You can see my slides on the screen, can you?
We can see you, but not your slides.
Oh, let me try again. Sorry, everyone.
Okay, so if you can try sharing your screen again.
Okay,
Yes, we can see it now.
Excellent. Okay, well, thanks very much. It's really good to be here, and I'm sorry I can't be there in person. In many ways, this is a third presentation. It has a lot more in common with what Kate was presenting, but I think, you know, in my heart, I'm more interested in modeling and labor market movements and so on within models. But I will be talking more about data today rather than models. And again, talking about sort of how can we measure employment in the broader agri-food system. And so I'm going to present some results from IFPRI's 2019 estimates, our most recent, from our global agri-food system database. So very much along the lines of what Kate presented, but with a different methodology. So let me start by saying, you know, why are we going to such lengths? I can think of 4 different groups that are trying to measure how much employment there is in the global agri-food system. And I guess I can think of 3 possible reasons why this is worth the effort, right? Why should we care? I think that the first is slightly academic, and that is that, you know, when we think about the canonical Peter Timmer model of agricultural transformation, we think of more and more economic activity and more jobs occurring off the farm. And so if we want to
a final point, it will
sorry. Can you still hear me? I'm hearing someone else's voice.
Yes, we can hear you. I think there was just a little bit of an interference. Please go ahead.
Okay, sure. Maybe they were more interesting. No, you know, we want to track agricultural transformation. And so in order to be able to track agricultural transformation, we need to be able to capture those jobs that are being created in the broader agri-food system. The second reason, of course, is that, you know, as agriculture's share of employment or share of the economy declines, even in low-income countries, it's becoming increasingly difficult to make the case for agriculture, to encourage continued focus and political will devoted to the agricultural sector. And so if we can show the broader implications and connections of agriculture to the rest of the economy, then we might have a much stronger case to make on behalf of agriculture. And then I think finally, you know, and this is more within our agricultural field, and certainly within developing countries, a lot of focus and attention is put on agriculture, primary agriculture. But as we increasingly see the agri-food system stretch beyond the farm, it could cause us to rethink some of our policy priorities. Maybe the best way to drive agricultural transformation is not to invest in agriculture itself, but in the broader agri-food system and pull agriculture along. And I think understanding what those linkages are across the different parts of the agri-food system are key. So those are the 3 reasons why I think, you know, this is worth the effort, and why we've gone to such great lengths at IFPRI, and why Kate's doing the same and others are doing similar efforts. But what do I mean by the agri-food system? And in some ways, this is my representation of what Kate was also showing, which is, you know, agriculture is far more than just farming. It's far more than just primary agriculture. It includes the downstream processing, the food services, the restaurants, the hotels, and so on that are providing food to customers ready-made. It's the traders and the transporters moving the goods from one point to the next, all the way to the final consumer or the export market. And then finally, it's also the input suppliers, shown in yellow, which are producing, domestically at least, the fertilizer and the fuels and the electricity and everything that goes into the actual farming and the processing of foods. So this is my view of the agri-food system, and I like this view, but I recognize it's not everyone's view. I like this because it's easy to map, like Kate's, to the different I6 sectors that a lot of our data comes from. I'm going to come at this differently than Kate. I'm not going to directly measure using surveys how much employment the surveys are estimating is in each of these different components or sectors, but rather I'm going to use national accounts data, which tells us at a very high resolution how much GDP is being generated in each detailed sector, and more importantly, what are the supply chain linkages between each of these sectors. And I'm going to calculate the size of the agri-food system using GDP, and then at the same time, using estimates of labor productivity, GDP per worker, I'm then going to infer how much calculate how many workers are being employed in each one of these nodes. And so I'm going to generate 2 different outcome indicators that are in our agri-food system database. The first is Ag GDP plus, which is agri-food system GDP, the total value added. And the second is agri-food system employment, or Ag employment plus. So where are we getting our data from? So because we're using national accounts, and national accounts are often based on supply use tables, or in the old days, input-output tables, we've got supply use tables for 122 countries, and these give very detailed breakdowns of the economy, and it allows us to estimate the size and the structural linkages between very detailed products and the final uses of those products. And that allows us to directly estimate the size and the structural linkages of those 6 agri-food system components that I just showed you on the previous slide. We're then going to use employment data from the ILO modeled estimates, which Kate has just slashed. And but for us, this is good because it allows us to have comparable data across countries. So, for example, all our workers are aged 15 or more, with all the problems that come with that standard definition recognized. And then finally, we're going to bring in GDP data and population data and other data from various other sources. Our 122 countries don't sound like much, but if you look at the map, these are the countries we've included, and it actually covers quite a large share of the global economy and the global level of employment. So we're covering about 97% of global GDP and 95% of total employment across the world. So there's about 80 plus countries that are not included, but these are relatively small, think island states and so on. So we've got pretty good coverage. From those 122 countries, we impute estimates for the remaining countries using an approach very similar actually to what Kate just presented. And this is the kind of output we get. And again, similar to what Kate presented, so I won't dwell on it too much, but we end up with estimates of the agri-food system, for example, for Ethiopia, where agriculture, farming, is about 33% of GDP in 2019. But the broader agri-food system, once we add in these other components, that's closer to half the economy, 46%. The gap, the size of the off-farm employment, so this should say employment, not GDP, 2/3 of the population or the workforce in Ethiopia are employed in agriculture, but there are still some jobs in those off-farm sectors that are also contributing to broader employment. And so that brings the total in the agri-food system up to 3/4 or 75% of total employment in the country. So we can directly estimate country by country, component by component, and actually value chain by value chain, how many people are employed in each of these different points within the agri-food system. And once we add this all up and we do our imputation to fill in that missing 5% or 3%, we can end up with a picture of the structure of the global agri-food system. So for low-income countries, even for low-income countries, agriculture makes up about 1/4 of the overall economy, but the agri-food system is 2/5 of the broader economy, with much of the off-farm GDP, this is still GDP, not employment, being generated by trade and transport. Not too surprising there. But once we get to high-income countries, that turns around. The farm component of the agri-food system is much smaller. And in fact, the off-farm components dominate. You get many more dollars of GDP off the farm for every dollar that you're getting on the farm. And that is true at the global level as well. And so what is the overall size of the agri-food system? Well, it's about $11 trillion in 2019. And most of the agri-food system is located or generated inside upper middle income countries, but high income countries, despite being very small and having a relatively small population, generates almost the same amount in terms of dollars. And so although the low and lower middle income countries have half the world's population, they produce less than 1/5 of the global, or account for less than 1/5. Their countries account for less than 1/5 of the global agri-food system, at least in terms of GDP. We can produce the same estimates for employment, again for 2019. And very similar to Kate, we've got about 1.3, our estimates suggest about 1.3 billion people are working in the global agri-food system, and about 1/3 of them are working in the off-farm sector. The lower middle income countries are a much larger contributor, or now a larger contributor to global agri-food system employment than you saw they were contributing to global agri-food system GDP. But you can see in these lower and lower middle income countries, most of the employment still remains squarely on the farm. So how is it possible that we have such a large global component of GDP coming from the off-farm, but very relatively smaller share of of employment, and that's because labor productivity is so much higher off the farm in lower income, lower middle income, and so on, all the way to higher income. And so clearly those off-farm jobs are a key driver of structural change. As workers move from farm to off-farm sectors, they're helping raise average labor productivity. And so this is a key part of that Timmer model of agricultural transformation, and we can track it more effectively by having these kinds of indicators. What I also haven't shown here is that much of that transformation first starts with processing, and then it moves to food services. And it's the food services that actually dominate in high-income countries, not the processing and not the trading and transporting. And so there's more information on our website from the database. So just to summarize, because we've only got 10 minutes, what can we take from this? And I think, we've got these new indicators. There are lots of different groups generating pretty much the same numbers at the end of the day. All of us are finding that the agri-food system is much larger than agriculture. That's no surprise. But that helps us, coming back to my initial point of why we're doing this, that really helps us make the case for a better case for agriculture, especially in low-income countries where agriculture is often seen as not seen as a particularly strong growth sector or a transformative sector. Secondly, we see labor productivity is much higher off the farm. And I think what that means, and what we're certainly seeing with these kinds of data when we put them in front of governments, is a much greater recognition that agricultural policy needs to shift from its almost singular focus on the farm to thinking beyond the farm and thinking more at the systems level rather than at sort of individual value chain by value chain. And then finally, I think hopefully we've shown, myself and Kate, that these are better indicators for tracking agricultural transformation, and Kate has already poked holes in some of the data that we're using. The bottom line is you can poke holes in all 4 of our groups that are working in this area, and so the bottom line is that we need more and better data, which is a classic way to end the presentation. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, James. And then thank you, Ali and Kate, for those insightful presentations. At this point, I'll just ask a few questions and I'll open it up. I just want to start with a so what question. That we've heard of the numbers that you have generated, and James, you also spoke about even computing some ag GDP. And my first question goes back to the policy component. Can we still make a case that agriculture is worth investing in as we think about ways to address global unemployment challenges? Is there a case to be made for agriculture given the numbers that you have generated for us today?
Yes, no, I think we certainly can. And I think we've shown that there is a lot of jobs being created, and increasingly more jobs being created off the farm as countries develop. And that requires investments in order to enable and create the jobs, and careful labor market policies and so on, as we heard in the second presentation, to make sure that labor markets are still functioning and flexible to allow those opportunities, to have that enabling environment. I think what we have to caution against, and I come from IFPRI, where we are singularly focused on things like agriculture, and we are often very enthusiastic about what can be achieved off the farm. And we're carefully measuring, particularly our value chain specialists are carefully measuring each and every job. I think what we've seen in all our numbers is that the off-farm sort of employment, especially in lower income countries, sort of is very low. The jobs are higher productivity, but are much more higher productivity, but they're relatively few. And so I think what we can see is that, the speed at which so the off-farm employment is in the agri-food system is highly unlikely to absorb as many people who are exiting agriculture. Mm-hmm. And so it has a role to play, but we shouldn't oversell just how much job creation is going to be created in those off-farm sectors. There are, in order to accommodate the exit from agriculture, most countries are going to have to rely primarily on sectors outside of the agri-food system, but we need to make the case still that those jobs in the agri-food system have a contribution to make. Thanks.
Okay, I will let Kate react to that also before I jump in with another question, which is also related to that. Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think for me, the so what question is focused on those jobs beyond agriculture. Because I think there are anecdotal stories and assumptions that there are wage gaps, for example, in those jobs, just like there are wage gaps in agriculture relative to other jobs. And we don't have a ton of evidence testing those hypotheses. Other concerns for me are issues of job quality, stability, wages, and safety. Things like in this country, at least, there's been a lot of work on the safety and then the meatpacking sector, et cetera. And so in low-income countries, as these jobs are expanding, what is the quality of those jobs, and are they safe? Are there violations of human rights, and are they any more remunerative and any way more of a pathway out of poverty than a job in agriculture? So for me, that's the so what.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. But then there is also this argument that the jobs that are, especially those that are outside the farming, still are very much dependent on farming. So for example, if you talk about the agro-processing industry, much of agro-processing industry have not taken off in low-income countries, primarily because there's a lack of consistent, there's a lack of raw material of consistent quality and quantity. So to the extent that you focus your emphasis beyond the farm, the base that you need to be able to support those non-farm work and also off-farm activities may not be there. So you may not be sustained over time. So is there a case to be made also for on-farm investment as part of that structural transformation to stimulate that multiplier effects that will generate employment in the off-farm as well as the non-farm?
If I can jump in there, I mean, I think certainly what the GDP data is telling us is that you know, there's a lot of emphasis coming out of MSU on the importance of purchased foods and marketed foods and processed foods, and I think that's absolutely true. That is where agri-food systems are shifting. But the value addition, the majority of the value addition, even in processed, purchased foods, is still sitting on the farm. And so if we cannot produce, if we cannot generate the value or the production on the farm, you know, the entire supply chain breaks down. And even when it's well functioning, most of the value addition is still happening on the farm. And I think that's, if I can just add to that point, you know, what we're seeing in Africa, for example, is that most of the agricultural transformation is really being driven, at least in East Africa, is really being driven by a rise of trade services, trade and transport. And most of that is actually quite low productivity. So this comes to your point about processing, that most of the value added off the farm, the growth that is happening in Africa is happening with the shift from subsistence to commercial agriculture, the rise of the trade and transport component. But processing and input supply, which are two of the high productivity components of the agri-food system, those are lagging far behind. And so at the moment, we're seeing agricultural transformation really driven from that shift from subsistence to commercial agriculture. But at some point, that driver will run out as subsistence levels reach very low levels. And then we will be left with an emphasis on trying to generate faster growth in processing and food services and so on, which is what we've seen in the more developed countries. Thanks.
Thank you very much, James. I think I will take you up on the other one of your last conclusions, which was data gaps, and I would direct that also to Ali. There's a lot of data gaps, and I know, Ali, your work focuses also in the US, and I'm just wondering, are there any differences in those data gaps if you look at your work here in the US compared to work that is happening in other countries, or especially low income countries? Where are those data gaps? Are there any differences? Ali can take that. Yes.
I guess I was hoping someone else could speak to the developing country context, but I could try to make something up. But within the US, it's quite interesting because relatively we have a lot of data. One of the biggest things I've noticed from working with a variety of data sources on agricultural workers is a lack of clear documentation on differences in how the data is collected. So for example, you mentioned health and safety of agricultural workers. So we just finished a paper, it should have just come out actually, on correcting the Bureau of Labor Statistics estimates of non-fatal injuries and illnesses in US agriculture. And for a variety of reasons, we find that they miss more than, so they miss about more than half of the injuries and illnesses, non-fatal, of US agricultural workers. So like part of that is they don't talk to small farms, so farms with fewer than 10 employees. They don't include injuries and illnesses of farm owners, operators, family members. So there's a variety of reasons that are really hard to uncover until you spend a lot of time reading data documentation. So, and that's kind of a resounding theme that I've come across with data sources in the US is just, there's a lot of exceptions specific to agriculture that are not well explained. So while we have a lot of data, there's a lot of differences even by state in terms of how that data is collected that aren't entirely clear. And so it can paint a very different picture depending on what data source you use, what assumptions you make. So that's what I'm seeing currently as a resounding theme in the US. I think that comparatively, you guys could speak to a developing country, but I would hypothesize there's less data available.
Okay, Kate, you want to take that?
This is the musical chairs panel. Certainly there are data gaps. I think the big ones for me are what I've already mentioned, missing trade and transport information, and especially as somebody who also works on gender, there's a lot of women who are food vendors, and the inability to have a good sense of what's going on in the trade sector really impedes our ability to understand what women are doing and how women's livelihoods might be changing with respect to the sector. And then the other thing that I didn't mention in my presentation is that the 19th Congress of the International Congress of Labor Statisticians, ICLS 19, which I think happened in 2013, so quite a while ago already, they adopted a resolution that if your main job is farming for own consumption, it doesn't count as being employed. Problem is that countries are changing their labor force surveys to adopt this resolution when they can or want to. And there's a variable to inform whether or not a country has or has not adopted this resolution yet. And so essentially you can tell whether or not the ILO data does or does not have people employed in farming for own consumption as their primary job. But once countries do adopt it, unless they implement a distinct own consumption labor module, which is theoretically what's supposed to happen, so that you would have not less information, but actually better information about those people. But of course, very few countries have done it. I think a recent meeting with someone from ILO, they mentioned 2 countries in Africa that have executed this additional own smallholder farmer subsistence farming module. So we essentially would lose information about smallholder farmers. And so that makes the data gap even worse.
James, do you want to speak a little bit to that since you highlighted that in your presentation?
Yeah, I think, you know, I wear 2 hats, and typically I don't do global things. And so coming up with a global estimate of the agri-food system is just really because we're sitting on the data that's needed to do that. And so, you know, in the way we chose to do it. And so it was a natural thing to do when asked. But normally we work at the country level. And at the country level, you've got to get your data right. And so we would never rely, for example, on ILO modeled estimates in our country level analysis. This has been a major challenge for us. And even relying on labor force surveys is problematic, that we often end up having to try and triangulate between population census data, labor force survey data, and then triangulating that with household surveys. Because once you overlay it with national accounts data, which of course is another totally valid data source, you end up with some very strange estimates. And so at the end of the day, this is more art than science, I think. when it comes to trying to estimate employment by sector, even broad sector. Even just employment in agriculture is extremely difficult to get at from any single survey or any survey at all. And so we often spend quite a bit of time just trying to estimate the most basic of statistics across multiple types of surveys. And so that's really the main headache for us generally when we're trying to report employment statistics or model them. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for that. So the other part would also be some of those methodological challenges. And I'm also wondering how you have dealt with some of them. I believe you had mentioned like the ISIC code, where it only had 2, and then the others that may have about 4. So in a situation where you have that, how do you go about it? Have there been ways that you have found most suitable to address some of these challenges that you face?
Is that to me again or to Kate?
Any of you could answer that.
I'm happy to get us started.
Yes.
So I mean, I think, and Kate alluded to this, and so it would be great to hear her thoughts as well, because I think one of the biggest challenges is estimating employment in the trade and transport sector, and it's actually and also the employment in the input suppliers that go in. And actually, the genesis of our whole effort actually came from USAID, actually an FAO conference way back in 2018, 17, I think it was. When we were asked by one of our key donors, sort of surely we can measure, the activities that are in satellite of agriculture as a whole. And they were really talking about input suppliers as a high potential job creator within the agri-food system in low-income countries. These kinds of input-supply relationships, input-output relationships, that's what triggered us to think, okay, well, we're sitting on these input-output tables, these supply-use tables, really. And that would allow us to tease out, what inputs are going into the agri-food system. This is what the group at Cornell are doing as well, coming at it again slightly differently than we are. But at the same time, then the trade and transport is the key. And this is where, we need to be able to somehow estimate how much trade and transport. We cannot assign the whole of the trade and transport sector to the agri-food system, because that would be a gross overestimate. But what we can do is measure the trade margins, the markups that are being charged on each and every product, on the food and agricultural products. And then we can isolate that as a part of the broader trade and transport sector. I think this is where, our approach is perhaps somewhat stronger. I think Kate's approach and others' approaches are much stronger on the employment data side for all the reasons Kate has talked about: secondary jobs, gender, etc. But I think this is a major methodological challenge. Each approach is good at doing something, right? But how do we bring them together? And I think that's a methodological challenge that we have yet to really solve. Thanks.
Thank you, James.
Thanks for that great setup, James. I can react to that. And I think, I hope that in our project, we're rising to the occasion on your call to bring the methods together. I think our first approach is potentially to work with James's data and to look at that share of GDP in those sections, and then see if we can model a conversion factor for employment. I think the challenging assumption there is that you would derive that conversion factor from the relationship between GDP and jobs in other parts of the food system. And I'm not convinced myself that we could do that we could make that assumption that it's going to be a similar relationship. I think some other approaches, I think it's gotten easier, especially after COVID, to collect data remotely and via mobile and telephone surveys, even in low-income countries. So from a primary data collection perspective, I think there's more opportunity than ever before to institute tailored surveys that can reach large numbers of potential traders and to do that remotely and efficiently. But I could be wrong if I were to actually try and execute that.
Thank you very much. I will open up, see if anyone has any questions.
Oh, okay. Oh, right, okay. This is just the data out there. My impression is that the data is heavily concentrated at national level statistics and household level surveys. And what we're missing is the firms in between. Is that accurate? I mean, I know that, you know, some countries do business surveys, but I don't know how heavily those focus on businesses related to ag or not. So I'm just curious if anyone has that data, like for any of the countries, would we trust it to try to get at the value chain in between household production and national accounts?
I don't know if James could do that.
James, did you hear that?
I did. It's a great question. I think, you know, it's for that very reason that I think two things. It's why I like using national accounts, because we know that national accountants are trying to capture exactly the outputs and the employment in those businesses. So not using the household surveys. In the household surveys, we are relying on those surveys picking up the workers who are employed in those firms. But we know that that our survey sample sizes are just not large enough to pick up the very detailed sort of differentiation of employment and all the jobs that are out there. And so that's why I think when it comes to estimating even employment by sector, we have to rely on sources like the population census and so on, which just give us a much better coverage, although much less precise estimate of sector of employment, but much better coverage of the overall working population. We need to triangulate those together. And we can use firm surveys to some extent, but they're sometimes difficult to sort of reconcile again with other sources. And so I would really call out, you know, the group at the Groningen Growth Center who are trying to do this triangulation, bringing in different data sources to get a consistent set of employment by sector. Anyway, thanks.
Thank you. Does any of you want to add to it?
Well, I think just to say, like, within the US, there are a variety of surveys for employment. I assume we're not asking all these.
I mean, I think the US is one of the few places where the BEA actually does survey farms.
Yeah, and so we have like census of ag, farm labor surveys, a survey of farms, and I think one of the interesting things that emerges that I've always been curious about how that looks in other countries is the employer surveys regularly report higher wages and higher earnings for workers than the worker surveys do. So there are like important differences that come out when you talk to employers versus workers. And then one other like data challenge I think a lot about is things like the quarterly census of earnings and wages asks employers for their number of workers, but then you have to consider, like, is that the number I care about? Because then what if one worker is working for multiple employers? And so there's like a challenge in counts going all directions. And yeah, so it's a good question.
Yeah. Can I just make a point on that? In our work with the household survey data, we also came to like, well, what do we actually want to count? Do we want to count workers or do we want to count jobs? Because when you start counting people employed or engaged and you're including their secondary and tertiary jobs, then it becomes a real challenge. And so we actually looked at like a complete matrix of whether or not people's jobs, what combinations of different sectors people's second and third jobs were in.
And Phil Martin on there has done some stuff with IRS records in California, trying to get up the number of jobs that the average farm worker holds for different employers.
Good.
I have two questions. My first question is directed to the first and third presenters, and my apologies if I didn't catch this. But so far in your work, how different of an ending spot have you landed compared with what exists in the statistics today? And then for the second presenter, I wanted to ask about sort of the root source. That you're working with the NAWS, and I remember the NAWS has a sampling frame of some sort that has like different regions of the country, and then it randomly draws places. And so there's a I think there's sort of explicitly a level of geographic detail where one can view it as statistically reliable. And then you're using that as raw materials for sort of even a more detailed exploration of labor markets. And I was wondering, you know, at what point do you know that you're pushing the data too far? Or like, you know, you don't have reliable information to say what's going on in Turlock, California, because NOS only works with very sort of broad regions.
Sure, I'll take the first question because I had a slide that I had to cut to stay to my 10 minutes that might help to answer the. Yes, exactly. This is from a piece of work from a paper that we published last year when the FAO project that I presented today was just getting started. And this is, there are a couple of related collaborators. This is from the Food Systems Countdown Initiative. And we are thinking about tracking changes across all of food systems. So one of the things that came up was employment, and we put this together to show all the different choices that you have to make and where the different estimates that were out at the time, so this came out last fall, were landing. And so I think if you were to take James's updated number, so here we have, he arrived at 1.2 billion, that was a year ago with very preliminary results that he was kind enough to share with us. But I think he said 1.3 in his final database. The estimate that's not on here because it's the new stuff that I presented today, we got to 1.1. And then the two smaller estimates, 0.74, that explicitly tries to keep things to just the ILO and Eurostat. If we included some data that we were able to get through a collaborator from China, that's how we got those smaller estimates. Those were very back of the envelope. So basically, I would say we're largely all in the same ballpark, is the main takeaway here. And so to me, taking multiple methods and arriving at similar estimate is a good sign.
I think I was going to say exactly the same thing. My 9-year-old would say there always has to be a winner. Okay, but I think in this case, we're all sufficiently close that, you know, we can all step back and say we're reasonably close. And then we have to think about, well, why did we do this in the first place? And I think it's and that's, of course, coming out of this very focused work that all of us are doing. I think each of us have very different uses of the data, but we can be fairly comforted that, you know, we've basically arrived within 100 million people, and that's good enough. Thanks.
I was gonna say one really quick.
Yes, go ahead, yeah.
So that's a really good question, and that's something I've struggled a lot with in using the NOS for many projects. And you're completely right. So the sampling frame is based on employment in the Farm Labor Survey. It's a survey done at the place of employment, so it does overcome a lot of issues that household surveys encounter in trying to capture agricultural workers. They often live in non-traditional housing and many other barriers, but it's a very small sample size compared to the American Community Survey, which captures even more agricultural workers than the NOS. So I have tried to replicate the American Survey communities or methodology, but like it doesn't work very well for ag workers. So the NOS still kind of emerges as the best data source for answering this question. And then the sampling methodology, that's part of the reason why I've only looked at it over the entire time span of the NOS thus far. So 28 years of data on this. So the pretty large sample size combined that kind of overcomes some of the sampling frame issues. So it's representative in 2-year bins in the 6 US regions. But if we expand the time frame we're considering, it can become more representative, but also more noisy because we have these movement patterns. And then the thing that made me think of that I have not really thought about is that the NOS is representative in terms of where the workers currently employed. There's no reason to think it would be representative in terms of like previous employment activity, but to the extent that that worker is representative of someone who's worked in that area, their migration pattern should be representative. But it's not hard, yeah, I don't know, it's not ideal as opposed to say that we have to be.
Thank you.
I I had a question kind of about what would we want to be counting if we didn't have data limitations. So when I look at the ERS numbers, the rough order of magnitude is 1% of US workforce on farm employment, 10% ag and related industries, right? You know, and with a fairly generous counting of what's ag and related, right? But then when I look at the ratios under US by geographic region, not by country, but it's country level, right? There I see that for the richest regions, it's 1-to-1 as opposed to the 1-to-9 that ERS counts. So I'm assuming that, I mean, what would we want to be as inclusive as what ERS is if we have the data? Do you think that's too inclusive? What's the right level for that kind of cross-country tracking and comparison and for moving forward and for changing the evolution of ag and agri-food workforces?
I think there's a couple of different things you would want to do depending on the policy objectives. I think that capturing everyone to make the case that this is an economically important sector and deserves investment, I think you want to be inclusive. And you also want to be able to make, or I guess, either testable hypotheses about the linkages between people moving in and out of farm employment. So one of the things I think we've been talking about in that project that I'm working on is, okay, are these some of the same people who do some farm work and some food vending? So I think there's a hypothesis that those may be some of the same people. And so then I think that's an investment or a case for investment, not only from a sector, but also from a place-based perspective about where these jobs are taking place. And then I forgot the second part of my response. I'll just turn it over to someone else.
James, do you want to take that also?
I'm afraid I didn't quite hear the question. Sorry, not to pass the buck. But...
yeah, I think he was asking what else would we like to measure if we do not have any data limitations?
Well, I mean, in the US context specifically, a lot of that comes from, we count, the ERS numbers are including hospitality, food, retail, food service, and that's 50% of what gets included in ag and related, right? So yes, it's higher in the US than in other countries, but when we look at this international and cross-country, should we be, is that the goal, to include all of those sectors, to include textile? Like, would we want to do that if we have the data, or is that too broad for types of purposes you've been developing?
I mean, I think, you know, I can only speak for myself, and my goal is not to become a professional measurer of employment. I think really what we want to do is, you know, do as good as we can at estimating job creation beyond the farm and the role of agriculture in creating those off-farm jobs, because it's capturing a lot of policy attention in developing countries, particularly in Africa, where the youth bulge has put high pressure on governments to create enough decent jobs. And so I think really what we'd like to do is show the trade-offs between sort of driving a sort of pro-poor policy agenda versus one that's about creating as many jobs as possible. And then secondly, and this is where the data gaps I think are still strongest across all of the methods that are being used, is to look at the quality of employment. And so to talk about not just as many jobs as possible, but to talk about whether those jobs are decent and hopefully attractive to young job seekers. And so I think, you know, that's the reason why we want to do this. When I've presented this kind of work before, people have said, have you included agricultural universities? Have you included employment within the agricultural ministry? And the list goes on. And I think at some point, enough is enough. And then we focus again, as I said, on sort of why we've gone to all this effort. But yes, but short answer, yes, I do think it's useful to capture employment even in low-income countries in these hospitality sectors and so on. I think they get a lot of attention by governments. Thanks.
I'll also say that it's not for me as much a quantification problem. That's my real interest, the identification. And so you have to develop a strategy to say, who are we counting? Who do we consider to be working in these sectors in order to just have a way to identify them so that you can ask the more important welfare question.
Thank you. I'm just wondering if there are any questions from our online attendees. But then while we wait for that, there is also the issue of looking into the future and how these jobs, in terms of the quality and the quantity, may change over time. And as we think about the different kind of factors that could shape those quality and quantity jobs, how do you see the role of technology? And I will direct that to Ali and also to James, James and Kate, that even outside of technology, are there certain kinds of drivers or mega trends that we need to be thinking about, and how we can bend these mega trends to produce the quality and in the quantity of jobs that the agri-food system could possibly offer. So Ali could address the issue of technology, and then Kate and James could also talk about some of the mega trends that we need to keep in mind as we think about it. Ali.
Yeah, so thank you. One of the ongoing pieces that I did not talk about was a report that we put together for the FAO this year. It should be coming out as a working paper soon. It's about the effects of technology on employment in the agri-food system. And one of our, well, several conclusions, but one in particular aligns with what James was showing today, which is that productivity is higher in off-farm processing and other sectors of the agri-food system than it is in on-farm. And what we see in the US is that's largely because the jobs that are left, so a huge employer in on-farm activities in the US is harvesting, are the ones that have been most challenging to mechanize. But because of worker shortages, we're seeing a growing drive to mechanize, so increased technology adoption, and a desire to make the jobs that remain more desirable for workers to have. So that's in terms of working conditions, it's in terms of danger, pay, all these things that we can hopefully enhance with improved technology. So I guess what I see going forward is this improvement in the working conditions that can hopefully solve this huge problem of worker shortages that we're facing, which is, you know, from a combination of factors. But the thing that we really focused on in that article was, how do we get there? Because the current farm workforce is not necessarily, doesn't necessarily have the skills they need to operate the new technology that might enter the scene. And so we need that training. And we also were trying to think about crossover across the different pieces of the agri-food system that might enable that. So like perhaps people who've been working in processing facilities might be more capable of taking those new on-farm jobs. So I think there's a lot of things that are going to happen with technology and job replacement in coming years, and they can speak more to a developing country context, but in the US, it's kind of this, it's being driven by not having enough workers. So we need to mechanize to improve the jobs that remain and for the people that want to stay.
I think for me, the biggest megatrend that comes to mind for low-income countries especially is electrification and urbanization, and the new opportunities that will bring for expanding what can be done in trade and food service and retail. And so I think those are the ones that really come to mind for me. But also migration, I think for everybody, is going to be a key force in shaping not just the agri-food system and its related sectors, but reshaping almost all of economic sectors.
Okay. So we've had technology, we had urbanization, electrification. James?
Yeah, no, I think, you know, it's really nice to hear. I mean, I think there's a nice linkage between, I mean, it's kind of ironic. I mean, Ali is talking about labor shortages and mechanization. And of course, in Africa, the concern is too many workers in agriculture and how are we going to get people off. But in actual fact, mechanization and labor shortages are also a concern in countries like Ghana, for example, where, you know, seasonal workers who used to come down from the north are now permanently moving to the city, which speaks to Kate's issue about urbanization. But I still think in aggregate, one of the big concerns is about is about how we produce farming, because that's where most of the employment in the agri-food system still happens. And I think the key gap we have here is we need to be able to provide, for example, mechanization services to farmers, smallholder farmers, and electricity to SMEs, as Kate was saying. But in a way that doesn't sort of, because if we don't do that, we're going to see what's happened in my country, South Africa, for example, where we have very large commercial farms with very low labor intensity coming up, because these are the ones who are able to afford their own tractors and their own mechanization and so on. And as a result, we get a premature exit of workers from agriculture, and there is no hope of the off-farm agri-food system absorbing these workers. And so we end up with potentially very high unemployment. So for me, I think if I'm going to, and since we're at an ag conference, I think for me, the technology that really matters in terms of employment in the agri-food system is what's still happening on the farm in terms of potentially labor-saving technology and a drive towards big commercial growth-oriented agriculture versus, the very difficult task of trying to support small-scale farmers and SMEs in the agri-food system so that they remain viable and vibrant and continue to employ the large numbers of people that they currently do. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Are there any other questions? Okay.
I'm curious how much. This is maybe pretty Africa specific, but how much Africa's land policies, particularly like avoiding land grab scenarios, is going to protect against or impede large commercial farming operations, and if that's a thing we need to worry about. I mean, I'm not sure I don't have a good sense of what a middle ground looks like between a low productivity farming with lots of people and a high productivity farming with low people, because I don't know, does that exist more?
Anyone who wants to look at, I'll take that.
I think that one's pretty fun.
Oh, okay, all right, I will go ahead and take that. I would say that when it comes to the context of the land tenure system in Africa, is quite complicated. And currently what we are seeing on the continent is there is a rise of what we call the medium-scale farmers. And the medium-scale farmers are African elites, individuals that work in the public sector or have worked of the farm and has accrued some rent, going back and using some of their rent to acquire land. And much of Africa's land was customary land, so land that was held communally. But now, because of pressures coming from these elites, some of those lands are being privatized. So we are seeing a weakening of that customary system, and they're giving rise to that medium scale farmers. So that is in addition to the widespread perception of land grabbing occurring on the continent. So that is an aspect of it. And I know that there is typically a push for maybe land titling that will ensure that people have secure property rights and be able to make that kind of investment. And my take on it had always been that it's a very simplistic view of looking at the issue, mainly from the standpoint that if land is communally owned, and I'll give an example in Ghana, if the land is owned by the clan, so long as you're a member of that clan, you have access to that particular land. And you may not be able to use it concurrently, but anytime the land becomes available, or if needed be, they will divide the land up so that you have an opportunity to have access to that land. If you title that land, whose name do you put on it? So my concern is it always ends up facilitating more of an elite capture than actually helping to develop that broad-based productivity gains that is needed to drive people off the farm, away from the farm into the off-farm sector. So that is my take on it. But there's been a lot of debate about whether should we go support small farms or support medium or middle. And my take is a continuum. And we've seen that there are a lot of multiplier effects that have results. As if you have in situations where we have medium scale farms, we are seeing expanded access to markets by smallholder farmers that are operating within the vicinity. We have also seen increased use of agricultural inputs by smallholder farmers that operate in that particular area. So it is not so much about supporting one against another as to think about what are the spillover effects, as well as what is the potential to generate that broad-based agricultural productivity growth that will stimulate that agricultural transformation that is needed. And typically that is the argument that is made about supporting supporting investment in the Agri-Food System, not so much about the direct job that is created as it is about the multiplier effects that is able to create because a large number of people that is already employed in that particular sector. So that will be my take on the question that you have on that. Good. So that takes us to just one more minute. Does anyone have a burning comment that they would like to make before we hang up? On this note, I just want to thank you very much. I want to thank our panelists, James, Kate, and Ali. And also want to thank you all for choosing to spend your afternoon with us. We appreciate you all. And thank you very much for this insightful discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.